Greetings, welcome to Module 1, Unit 10 on cognitive processes. In the earlier unit, we understood the need for a taxonomy of learning, the structure of Bloom's taxonomy, and the elements of revised Bloom's taxonomy. In this unit, we will look at the cognitive process dimension. The outcome for this unit would be understand the cognitive processes of remember, understand and apply of revised Bloom's taxonomy. Recall that the cognitive processes of revised Bloom's taxonomy are 6 in number, hierarchically organized: remember, understand, apply, analyze, evaluate and create. Remember is the cognitive process of lowest complexity in the hierarchy. Remembering is retrieving relevant knowledge from the long-term memory. The relevant knowledge may be factual, conceptual, procedural or some combination of these. Remembering knowledge is essential for meaningful learning and problem solving. Thus, even though remembering is a cognitive process of low complexity, it is an essential competency that learners must acquire and demonstrate. This process has two sub-processes: recognizing, recalling. Recognizing essentially means that the solutions are presented and the learner is able to recognize the correct response from the presented solutions. Recalling is recalling from long-term memory based on certain keyword that is provided to the learner. The associated action verbs are recognize, recall, list, tell, locate, write, find, mention, state, draw, label, define, name. We can continue with several such action verbs. Primarily, this cognitive process means that the learner is recalling from the long-term memory what has been conveyed by the instructor earlier. Sample activities and questions can be like this: state the condition for maximum efficiency of a transformer. The student can memorize and then recall from her long-term memory the condition for maximum efficiency of a transformer. State the assumptions of working stress method and limit size method in connection with the design of concrete structures. Draw the stress strain curves for concrete in compression under the ideal test conditions and laboratory test conditions. We can have a stem like name the. We can continue it the way we want. Name the parts of this particular machine. Name the major units of a computer. So, we can have several variations with the common stem of name the. Similarly, another common stem can be how many. How many general purpose registers are there in 8086 microprocessors? How many primitive data types are there in C language? We can have any number of variations like this. They all come under the remember cognitive process. The next higher level cognitive process is understand. As mentioned in the last unit, understand is tricky. Many teachers object to the use of understand in the outcome statement. They think that understand does not represent an observable behavior of the learner. However, revised Bloom's taxonomy does permit the use of understand. Understand is made very specific in the revised Bloom's taxonomy. There are several sub-processes under the category of understand. These sub-processes delimit the meaning of understand. They make this cognitive process an observable behavior from the student. Thus, it is accepted in the revised Bloom's taxonomy to use the word understand. Understanding is constructing meaning from instructional messages. Instructional messages can be verbal, pictorial, graphic, or symbolic. Instructional messages are received during lectures, demonstrations, field trips, performances, or simulations, in books, or on computer memories. During any learning experience, the learner can be receiving the instructional messages, and understanding is constructing meaning from such instructional messages. In the revised Bloom's taxonomy, there are 7 sub-processes in the category of understand. They are interpret, exemplify, classify, summarize, infer, compare, and explain. Interpreting, changing from one expression to another. This is also known as translating. Typical learning experience would be that the student is given certain information in one form, student has to translate that into a different form. Definitely this would imply understand. A typical example can be that the problem is presented in an English language and a student has to formulate this as a linear programming problem. This is one example of interpreting. The next subcategory is exemplifying, giving a specific example or instance of a general concept or principle. Providing a specific example of a viscous fluid that we encounter in daily life. The category is given and the learner has to provide a specific instance belonging to that category. The complementary sub-process is classifying, recognizing that a specific instance belongs to a certain category. Here the instructor provides a specific instance and the learner has to identify the category to which that specific instance belongs. Summarizing, abstracting, generalizing. Inferring, abstracting a concept or principle from a set of examples. A related process is to use this inferred principle to create a new instance. An example of executing a cognitive process associated with apply, the next higher level category. Inferring and executing are often used together on cognitive tasks. Here we have a series of specific instances and the learner has to infer the principle according to which these instances are being created. So, the cognitive sub-process involved is inferring. An example could be that the learner is presented with a series of numbers and she has to infer what is the rule based on which this series is being produced. If she can infer this rule, she can create the next numbers in the sequence. The next sub-process is comparing, detecting similarities and differences between two or more ideas, concepts, events, etc. This can contribute to reasoning by analogy also. Then the next sub-process is explaining. People use the word explain in a very generic sense, but explaining in the revised Bloom's taxonomy has a very specific meaning. a student is able to construct and use a cause effect model of a system to explain a phenomena or determine how a change in one part of the system affects the other parts. The key word here is cause effect model. The student must be able to construct a cause and effect model of the system. The model may be derived from a formal theory or it may be an empirical model. A variety of assessment strategies are possible with respect to this sub-process. Assessment could include reasoning, troubleshooting, redesigning and predicting. The assessment could include, for example, description of a system which is not functioning the way it is expected to function. The specific behavior is described by the instructor. The learner has to figure out the reason why the system is behaving in that particular fashion. An example of troubleshooting, or the system's behavior is described and an intended change in the behavior is also specified and learner has to redesign the system. So, that also would come under explaining. Notice that this, if it is extended further, can move into the apply category also. So, there are several possibilities of assessing the student's understanding in this particular subcategory. The action verbs associated with the understand process: for interpreting, translate, paraphrase, represent, clarify; for exemplifying, illustrate, instantiate; for classifying, categorize, subsume; for summarizing, generalize, abstract; for inferring, find a pattern, extrapolate, predict; for comparing, contrast, compare, match, distinguish, differentiate. There can be several such action verbs. For explaining, construct a model. Explain itself can be used as the action verb. Some sample activities and possible question formats. Explain why in a DC machine flux per pole decreases with increase in load. The student must construct a cause and effect model and explain the stated phenomena. Compare memory mapped I/O and peripheral mapped I/O techniques. Explain the use of virtual base class. What would happen to the performance of searching using binary search tree as the number of insertions and deletions keeps increasing? Write a brief outline. We can continue this question in several different ways. Distinguish between, we can give certain number of categories. Provide an example of, specify a category and the learner has to provide an example of it. Provide an example of emerging properties. These are all the possible formats. The next higher cognitive process is apply. Use procedures to perform exercises or solve problems. This is closely linked with procedural knowledge. There are two sub-processes associated with apply: executing, implementing. Executing, solving a task for which the right procedure is already known. This produces clear solutions. Routinely carry out the procedure clearly indicated in the problem itself or the context, and the context is familiar in the sense that the assessment context is quite similar to the instructional context. The teacher has explained a particular procedure, the teacher has explained how to solve a specific problem using that particular procedure, and the learner executes that procedure to solve a very similar problem. The next sub process is implementing. This implies solving a problem that has features which have not been encountered in that form earlier. That means, the context in which the learner is operating is somewhat different from the instructional context. Student has to select a procedure, may have to even modify it to solve the task. It may be necessary to use other cognitive processes like understand. Learner may have to understand the context, the problem, the conditions implied in order to either select a procedure or modify a procedure if the learner has to solve the problem. Thus, the learner is operating beyond the context which was present during the instruction. Thus, we can see that apply category is a spectrum. At one end, we have the narrow, highly structured execute. As we move to the other end, we may have to select a procedure to tackle a new solution, a new situation. As we keep moving along the spectrum to the other end of implement, we may have to modify a procedure, then we may have to devise a new procedure based on our conceptual knowledge. And thus, we are moving gradually towards the cognitive process of create itself. Thus, apply is a spectrum. At one end, there can be a very routine execution of a known procedure in a known context to solve a problem that is quite familiar. At the other end of the spectrum, it may involve considerable talent on the part of the student to use her conceptual knowledge to come out with a modified procedure or a new procedure to solve a problem which she is encountering probably for the first time in that specific form. Thus, the capabilities, the competencies implied by apply can be fairly wide, from a narrow, highly structured execute to fairly complex process of implement, which is at the other end of apply. The action verb associated with the apply cognitive process would be determine, calculate, compute, estimate, solve, draw, modify, etc. Notice that the action verb remains the same whether we are operating at the low end of the apply or high end of the apply. Whether the problem is something which the learner is completely familiar, or the problem is something which the learner is not all that familiar with, we might use the same action verb of determine. The instructor has to decide what should be the scope of apply activity. Sample activities and questions. Calculate time taken by a 200-ton motor coach to attain speed of 50 kilometers per hour when it starts up in a gradient of 30 in 1000. The motor coach has 4 motors, with each motor developing 6000 Newton meter torque during acceleration when it starts from rest, and has a gear ratio of 4. The gear transmission efficiency is 90%, wheel radius is 45 centimeters, train resistance 15 newtons per ton, and rotational inertia 10%. This might be the low end of apply or high end of apply depending upon what the instructional context was. Whether the learner is completely familiar with problems of this type, or whether the learner is encountering a problem of this specific nature for the first time. These aspects would determine at which end of the apply spectrum the learner is operating. Another example can be the primary and secondary windings of a 40 kVA 6600 volts by 250 volt single phase transformer has resistance of 10 watts and 0.02 watts respectively. The total leakage reactance is 35 watts as referred to the primary winding. Find full load voltage regulation at a lagging power factor of 0.8. The general stem can be determined. So, we can continue this in several different ways. Compute, again we can continue this in several different ways. Exercise, give 2 examples of activities from the courses you taught or learned that belong to the cognitive levels of remember, understand and apply. We thank you for sharing the results of the exercise at nate.iacta@gmail.com. In the next unit, we will look at the remaining cognitive processes of Revise-Bloom's taxonomy. We will understand the cognitive process of analyze, evaluate and create. Thank you. We will meet in the next unit. Thank you.